So this morning we heard a little bit about political legitimacy and sacral models of kingship. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty and how you take that power. Our panel on militant lamas and magical warfare. Our first speaker is Brian Cuevas from Florida State University, who will be talking about the politics of magical warfare.
We run a tight ship here at the Rubens, so I will not be riffing today. I'm going to be reading the text. So as I understand it, this exhibition, Faith and Empire, is dedicated to the late Elliot Sperling for his unfailing energy, inspiration, and incomparable scholarship. In 1996, Professor Sperling published a brief but incisive article, Orientalism and Aspects of Violence in the Tibetan Tradition, which marked one of the first steps in the dismantling of a persistent romance, a fanciful stereotype of Tibetan Buddhism as the quintessential religion of peace and nonviolence, and the Dalai Lamas, past and present, as paradigms of Gandhian pacifism. And Professor Sperling's effort here to bring much needed context and critical sensitivity to a challenging topic, and in turn to humanize Tibetans and their history, their culture. He does well to remind us of the messy realities of the human condition, of worldly existence, of those, quote, aspects of life that breed strife and discord. And in that messiness, he argues, Tibetan Buddhism was made, quote, a vehicle for power in the arena of world history, first for Tongut emperors, then for Mongol, Chinese, and Manchu rulers. Tibetan Buddhism, from this perspective, was a means toward the attainment of power, and in defense of and for the spread of the Buddhist doctrine. Indeed, Tibetan Buddhism is rich with an abundance of methods, techniques for the attainment of such power, both for religious and political ends. And as much as there are Tibetan rituals too numerous to count for acquiring the wisdom and benevolence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas for achieving goodwill, peace, and healing, there are also nearly an equal number designed for coercion, suppression, and violent harm. They include the usual tantric empowerments, ritual offerings, ceremonies involving wrathful deities, but also rituals to repel and suppress aggressive forces, casting ritual cake bombs, and preparing effigies personifying the enemy, deployed like Tibetan voodoo dolls. In a word, these are the weaponized vehicles of Tibetan Buddhist power. And in the interest of cross-cultural comparison, we might describe them as a form of Buddhist magic, maybe even sorcery, and in a certain political circumstances, specifically a type of magical warcraft, makto in Tibetan. So to begin, let me clarify my use of the terms magic and sorcery in a Buddhist context. I define them both as involving a combination of ritualized acts that manipulate hidden links or bonds of macro and microcosmic correspondence, which in the traditional universe of Tibetan Buddhism are presumed to exist between living beings and their greater external environment, earth and sky, planets and stars, and so forth. In addition, such ritualized acts typically involve the appropriation of the powers of deities, either benign or wrathful, to accomplish specific goals. Those goals are generally understood to be fourfold: pacification of harmful forces, enrichment of lifespan, merit, and pleasures, subjugation or control over living beings, and destruction of enemies. These last two goals, subjugation and destruction, relate directly to what I refer to as Buddhist sorcery. In addition to pacification, they comprise the predominant aims of Tibetan magical warfare. Throughout Tibetan history, we find ample evidence that Tibetan tantric masters, Buddhist tantric masters, frequently resorted to such rites of magic and sorcery in attempts to gain power or defend against hostile forces, compelling wrathful deities, expelling demons, and causing harm or death to rivals and enemies. In so doing, these ritual specialists drew upon traditions of accepted Buddhist practice inherited primarily from India. The Tibetan historian Taranatha, an accomplished ritualist himself, records the names of numerous Indian Buddhist sorcerers from as early as the 9th century who utilized these magical operations as implements of war. He recounts, for example, the ritual successes of several panditas and master yogis who worked aggressively to defend the famous Buddhist monastery of Vikramasila against Turk invasions from Central Asia. Now, in Tibet, legend has it that once the trail had been blazed by Padmasambhava, these and other similar traditions of ritual warcraft began to be steadily transmitted to Tibetans. Nup Sangye Yeshe is one of the earliest Tibetan masters of such rites and a bearer of Padmasambhava's direct lineage. Nup was active in the turbulent period of the late 9th and early 10th centuries following the collapse of the Tibetan Empire. During that period, territorial feuds and civil uprisings dominated central Tibet, and in the midst of this chaos, Nup is said to have deployed on multiple occasions the fierce rites of Yamantaka, here in the form of Yamari, to defend against and subjugate his anti-Buddhist rivals and to secure the good fortunes of the Tibetan people. All told, Nup Sangye Yeshe stands as Tibet's first Buddhist political sorcerer. As the 10th century drew to a close, a period of renewal began to unfold. Tibetan historians describe this period as a Buddhist renaissance during which new competing Buddhist sects emerged. These new sects would come to include the Kadampa, the Sakyapa, the various branches of the Kagyupa, and much later the Gyulupa. This was the age of the master Siddhas and accomplished translators, many of whom preserved or augmented the tantric ritual traditions of earlier generations. Others traveled south to India and Nepal and brought back with them a wealth of innovative ritual systems like Guhya Samaja, Chakrasamvara, Hevajra, Mahakala, Vajrabhairava, and so forth. By the 12th century, many prominent tantric ritualists, almost all of whom could claim descent from noble families, had succeeded in establishing their own authoritative religious institutions that also came to serve as bases of local governance and political influence. One such figure was Lama Shang, who in 1175 founded the monastery of Selguntang in central Tibet. Carl will tell us much more about this fascinating character shortly. He's up next. But let me say briefly that Lama Shang is renowned for having employed his own militia and to have engaged in mortal combat with his rivals to secure and defend his interests in the Lhasa Valley. For this reason, rightly or wrongly, and Carl will let us know, Lama Shang has become widely recognized as Tibet's paradigm of the militant Lama. He is, moreover, notorious for having enhanced his capabilities on the battlefield by relying on the hostile powers of the fearsome deity Mahakala, who Karma, I think, will be speaking of later. These powers he was able to channel through the inherited rituals of a 12th century master from Tangut named Sami Lotsawa. Lama Shang had received and perfected these rites from his own guru, who himself was a direct disciple of this Tangut master. It's worth noting that Sami Lotsawa once composed a tiny booklet of instructions on how to overthrow governments by utilizing the skull rites of Mahakala, likely in the form of the figure you have here in this image of the raven-headed or crow-headed Mahakala. This text was introduced and translated by Professor Sperling in 1994. One of Lama Shang's own Tangut students, Tishri Repa, carried on Sami Lotsawa's legacy of magical warcraft at the Tangut court, where he was called on to perform Mahakala rituals against the Mongols during their siege of the Tangut capital in 1210. Tishri Repa may have been the earliest of the celebrated Mongol repellers in Tibetan and Inter-Asian Buddhist history, and it's this group that I'd like to focus on for the remainder of this presentation. The tradition of Mongol repelling in Tibet first emerged in the mid-13th century in reaction to the incursions of Mongol forces. Soon thereafter, the Mongol ruler, Khotan, forged alliances with the Sakyapa and Song through the charismatic leader Sakyapandita. Some Tibetan historians characterize this period as a time of great fear and misery caused by rampant Mongol abuses, reportedly reaching a climax around 1281, when Mongol troops led by Kublai Khan were brought in to capture and kill a renegade Sakya governor. A decade later, the administrators of Sakya used Mongol mercenaries to wreak havoc on their rivals, including the sacking of Trigung Monastery. Records from this period describe a small band of Tibetan tantric practitioners hostile to the Sakya-Mongol alliance, roaming the country performing magical rites aimed at turning away and defeating the Mongol invaders. This ritual tradition of Mongol repelling persisted throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, sustained and embellished by Buddhist visionaries such as Teni Lingpa and Chokten Gyönpo, both of whom served at the court of Mongyul Guntang in western Tibet. Teni Lingpa was a Nyingma Lama whose earlier ritual effort to repel Mongol armies in central Tibet was sponsored by both the king of Guntang and the Latsun of Samye. Chokten Gyönpo was also supported by the same king, had been a close disciple of the illustrious Tertun Pema Lingpa, from whom he received special esoteric instructions on turning back Mongol armies. Chokten Gyönpo subsequently became a great ritual defender of the Lhasa Valley and a notorious master of Buddhist warcraft, broadly targeting the emergent Gelugpa sect, and specifically the monks of Drepung. The rise of Gelugpa influence in and around Lhasa can be traced back to the consecration of three major monasteries in the vicinity of Lhasa by Tsongkhapa and his followers, with the patronage of the Pakmodrupa, Ganden, Drepung, and Sera. But also of great consequence to their success, according to internal records, were the Gelugpa's own wizards of warcraft, active from the 15th century onward. They included such luminaries as the third and fourth Dalai Lamas, the notorious senior abbot of Ganden and Drepung, Mönlampel Lekpe Lodru, and much later, of course, the fifth Dalai Lama and his gifted assistant, the Nyingma astrologer, Zur the Omniscient, Chüying Rangdro, who did well to uphold the legacy of Lama Shang at Selguntang, which he began managing in 1633. These Gelugpa ritualists, all of them monks, garnered great prestige for their skill and magical rites to promote their own Tibetan and Mongolian coalitions and to drive back or destroy their regional competitors, those Mongol repellers and other anti-Gelugpa forces operating predominantly in Song and neighboring territories. Now, from the late 1500s onward, increasing involvement of the Mongols in Tibetan politics provoked violent reactions among non-Gelugpa groups, especially the Karmapa, the Trigompa, and the Nyingmapa. Among the most powerful of the ritualists defending against Gelugpa-backed Mongol incursions during this chaotic period were the Nyingma Tertun Shikpo Lingpa and his disciple Lodrö Gyaltsen, aptly nicknamed Sotopa, the one who repels Mongols. Around 1614, Sotopa wrote a fascinating little book, largely autobiographical, entitled A History of How the Mongols Were Repelled, in which he details over a period of 4 centuries the efforts of some of Tibet's most noteworthy political visionaries, including himself, who fought the Mongols using specialized rituals designed to combat foreign armies. In his text, Sotopa establishes the legitimacy of these ritual actions and demonstrates their effectiveness. The authority of the Tibetan prophecies of Sotopa's teacher, Shikpo Lingpa, and his interpretations of those prophecies at different points in history are a centerpiece of the work. Recently, James Gentry has written extensively about this memoir and of Sotopa's dramatic career, so I encourage those who are interested in this subject to consult James's studies. This prophet Shikpo was a controversial figure. He was a Nyingmapa supported by Trigomba and Karmapa patrons who rose to become a contemporary antagonist of the third Dalai Lama. He appears to have been most active in the Kyormalung region on the western outskirts of Lhasa, but was later linked directly to the very center of Lhasa as a master of flood control and protector of the Jokhang temple. In this capacity, Shikpo came into direct ritual competition with his Gelugpa rivals. The Gelugpa responded by denouncing Shikpo as a dangerous black magician and false prophet. Later, the fifth Dalai Lama would even include him and Tsoktopa among a select group of rogue political visionaries whose prophecies were deemed treasonous and whose writings were sealed and banned from publication. I should emphasize that as much as Shikpo Lingpa, Tsoktopa, and other similarly minded ritualists of the Nyingmapa and Kagyu orders worried about the rising presence of the Gelugpa in Lhasa and the increasing influence of the Mongols in Tibetan affairs, the Gelugpa in turn felt equally threatened by the disparaging prophecies of Shikpo Lingpa and his cohorts and feared the potency of their anti-Mongol, anti-Gelugpa sorcery. So what was this sorcery exactly? What rituals were involved? How were they performed? Shikpo Lingpa offers a model example in his famous 25 methods for repelling armies, a cycle of liturgies he discovered as Terma around 1544. These are the rites Tsoktopa himself utilized 40 years later in his long campaign against the Mongols. Only 2 texts from this cycle attributed directly to Shikpo Lingpa have survived. One of them gives us basic procedural details of just 8 of the 25 methods. And, you know, as by way of conclusion, I'd like to highlight some details of these rituals. Basic to most of Shikpo Lingpa's rituals is the use of effigies produced in the likeness of the enemy. In all cases, the uses of effigies in ritual are based on sympathetic assumptions that persons or things sharing a resemblance can act on one another at a distance. Similarity of appearance indicating that the two are linked directly by invisible bonds, and thus it is possible for one to be manipulated by the other. The effigy embodies and makes present through sympathetic means the intended target or victim. Paper drawings of effigies used in such rituals usually depict a naked human figure or animal hybrid with hair standing on end, arms chained behind its back, knees bent, joints pierced or broken, as we see here. The effigy is then bound by the requisite mantra, spells, or curses, and in some cases, the victim's joints are symbolically broken by folding the inscribed paper at the neck, elbows, knees, or ankles. Finally, the target is liberated or driven away and the image discarded at the conclusion of the rite, usually by burning it in a ceremonial fire offering. The thread cross ceremony requires the use of an ornate handmade object consisting of a multicolored threads woven around a frame of wooden sticks like a web. These act as used as a type of cage to ensnare the spirit or consciousness of the intended target. Following Shikpo Lingpa's instructions for this practice, the thread cross is to be set up with a triangle at its base. The ritualist is directed to draw effigies of foreign soldiers and their horses on corpses, shrouds. These are then placed inside the triangular's foundation, offered as a gift to the deity whose presence and assistance is being invoked. Also, while reciting the specified mantras, the ritualist is supposed to pelt the thread cross with charmed mustard seeds. Finally, the entire framework should be thrown in whatever direction the enemy army is camped or from wherever the troops are expected to approach. This action is supposed to diminish the life force of the enemy and to make them retreat. The ritual of hurling cake bombs, or torzur. Shikpo Lingpa instructs that the ritualist should imagine a sacrificial fire pit in front of the enemy's guardian deities, concentrating on the torma as a weapon, and taking aim, the ritualist should hurl the object in the direction of the enemy, and imagine that the strength of their guardian deities is depleted. The ritualist should then imagine that the enemy troops become paralyzed or unconscious. At the same time, the ritualist should vividly imagine all the local spirits fighting in his corner, emerging from the hurled weapon to strike at the enemy, binding their hands and feet and devouring their flesh and blood. The ritual for repelling armies using a cloaking stick or a wand of invisibility requires the consecration of various charmed ingredients and other magical potions, and all of which are to be placed atop mountains for the most effectiveness. Now, for Shikpo Lingpa, his disciple Sotopa, and the countless other Tibetan adepts before and after them who relied on mastery of Buddhist rituals to assist allies or to defend against enemies, successful achievement in the practice of sorcery and magic meant successful accomplishment in the exercise of military power and the establishment of righteous rule. But indeed, as I have hoped to demonstrate in this very short summary presentation, Buddhist sorcery and magic have long served in Tibet as legitimate expressions of political action. Belief in the efficacy of sorcery and magic derived from a worldview that saw the sorcerer and the warlord, the lama and the politician operating within a singular coherent system. In traditional Tibet, the political and the religious were never clearly separated. In the end, the tantric ritualist's arsenal of magical assaults and counter-sorcery initiated during Tibet's many periods of conflict and war proved to be just as vital to the success of the intended political outcomes as were the military swords and artillery fire. Warfare for Tibetan Buddhists was always a magical endeavor. Thank you.
That's okay. All right, moving right along, from a more specific example now. Carl Yamamoto from Towson University will be talking about vanquishing the enemies of the teachings, Tantra and warfare, according to Shang Tselpa.
It's like a plexiglass lectern or something. I thought you were supposed to be able to hide behind them. Okay. Shang Tselpa, the controversial founder of the Tselpa Gyupa, earns a mention in a provocative passage from the 16th century Scholars' Feast Dharma history, which quotes Urgenpa Rinchen-Pal as stating, although it's generally taught that being subject to rebirth in the 3 bad realms are among the 10 subjects suitable for liberation, no one has actually practiced fierce manifest activities except Virupa in India and Shang Rinpoche in Tibet. Now, this dense passage will eventually need to be taken apart some, but for now, let's reduce it to its bluntest terms. Urgenpa seems to be saying that Shang engaged in what Common Meinart describes as spiritually motivated ritual murder. And given the political power he was amassing at the time, we might, without too much exaggeration, expand that to politically motivated ritual murder. So, how do we make sense of this? Let's start with some historical context. Shang Tselpa was a key figure in what Tibetan histories call the period of the later spread of the teachings, or the Chidar, roughly the late 10th through the mid-14th century, a time of intensive Buddhicization of Tibetan culture. Though a figure of controversy, he succeeded in putting together one of the first successful post-imperial polities based in Lhasa, helping to transform it from a fairly provincial site with strong religious and imperial associations into a powerful locus of Tibetan religious and political life. A transformation that would culminate in the ascent to power of the Dalai Lamas some 400 years later. It would not be completely inappropriate to think of Shang as a sort of proto-Dalai Lama. The themes of magic and violence recur throughout Shang's life. He habitually walked a tightrope between virtue and vice, a duality he himself recognized, commenting that faith and sin were mingled. I was full of contradictions. It is, in fact, these contradictions that make Shang's biographies stand out when compared to the monochromatically virtuous life stories of contemporaries such as the first Karmapa. For instance, after dutifully listing the classical Buddhist texts he was taught, he comments wryly, "I didn't understand any of it." Again, though it's reported that the young Shang, like other spiritual prodigies, exhibited a preternatural sensitivity to the suffering of living beings, he also reports incidents like this. "I killed and ate baby fish from Clearwater ponds. I even swallowed a little baby fish. I cut off the rear end of a meat fly, put a flower there, and sent it flying off. I think it's the ripening of that karma that I'm now constipated and flatulent." He did, however, exhibit from an early age a native talent for ritual and magic. In his late teens, spurred, according to the Blue Annals, by family feuds, he begins to practice wrathful magical rites to suppress enemies. As he describes this period, I can't see this. Sorry. You can see this was all well rehearsed. As he describes this period, "In my 18th year, virtue was cut off by previous bad karma. Encountering obstacles from Maras, for 3 years I practiced demonic magic." Now, according to the accounts in the biographies, these magical rites involved the invocation of Dharma protectors, or the Chogyong, the construction of mandalas, the sacrifice of goats, and the offering of tormas and bowls of blood. Now, identifying specific rituals is difficult in this case, but the lists of teachings received report his receiving in his teens from at least 3 different sources instructions on the performance of wrathful liberation, or drolwa, rituals centered around the tantric Dharma protector Redyamari, Shinje Marpo. In some texts, the ritual is identified as radrol, which suggests perhaps a goat sacrifice, though in others the term is spelled, it's the same Ra, only with a wazur, which implies something involving horns. I won't attempt to resolve this except to say that in some representations, Redyamari's mount, a buffalo, does indeed possess horns. On the other hand, as we've seen, the ritual clearly included the sacrifice of a goat, and goats do, after all, also possess horns. Shortly thereafter, saddened by the death of his parents, he travels to Kham and takes the 5 precepts of pure conduct, intent on holding to the path of virtue. Still, as before, however, he backslides into destructive tantric magic, again at the expense of unlucky goats. As a result of these activities, he acquires the epithet Great Magician of Central Tibet, Uba Tuchen, as well as a following of disciples. Later in a self-eulogy, Shang would reframe these acts as bodhisattva deeds. In midlife, out of wrathful compassion, through the power of past karma, you did magical practices. You neither harmed nor injured others. Revisionist history notwithstanding, it's quite clear from other texts that Shang at the time regarded these actions as harmful and non-virtuous. This all comes to a dramatic climax in his last wrathful magic session. Thinking, the Dharma protectors will be displeased, I threw the 5 captured tormas to the ground, spilled the clay bowl of blood in the 2 fires, and kicked the mandala around. From that time up to the present, I have never prayed to the Dharma protectors for the purpose of conquering enemies, which is actually kind of an unusual, it's a funny statement, as we'll see from subsequent developments. After this decisive episode, magic disappears from Shang's life for a time. He swears off worldly sorcery and becomes a fully ordained monk, eventually taking up the practice of the solitary wandering cotton wearer, or repa, following his hero Milarepa. So he writes, "There's no one like me when it comes to wandering in the mountain retreats. I'm like Milarepa, wandering in the snow all day and all night." Now, In choosing the hermit Repa path, he explicitly rejects both patrons and disciples as worldly obstacles to serious religious practice. So, with this regard, he says, I thought to myself, what's the use of disciples and patrons? I need to be able to act without forethought. Shang might well have lived out the rest of his life as a solitary yogin, but for a fortuitous sequence of events occurring in 1160, his 38th year, which brought him unexpectedly the expansive with the throat, the overpowering with the heart, and the fierce with the navel. In the fierce practice, the meditator visualizes a mandala at the 64-spoke navel chakra. Appearing on the chakra is a yellow-green, what's called a chunjung, which in this case doesn't mean Dharma history, it means more like source of all phenomena, or almost like a womb out of which all things are born. It's two interlocking triangles that resemble somewhat a Star of David, out of which emerge the yellow-green principles, the wrathful Buddha Karma Heruka and his consort Karma Krodeshvari, encircled by yellow-green mantras and a retinue of goddesses and dakinis. The climax of the ritual is the visualization of light radiating from the principles and the retinue in the 10 directions and destroying visualized evil-doing enemies whose migrating consciousnesses are then set onto the 5 paths that lead to Buddhahood. The second ritual is much more complicated and brings in one of the more elusive of the wrathful deities worshipped by the Tselbas, and this is the crow-faced protector, an emanation of Mahakala. You see the 4-armed Mahakala, which is the one that Tselbas worshipped. A statue of this deity can still be found in the protector chapel of Shang's principal monastery, Tselkung Tang, across the river from Lhasa. According to lineage documents, Shang received these teachings from one of his root lamas, Galo Tsawa, a fascinating character who also taught the first Karmapa, Tusum Kempa, and the first Pamodrupa, Dorji Gelbo. Galo received teachings from, among others, Zami Lotsawa, who's also come up a couple times already, the great Tangut translator, and endured many harrowing encounters while meditating in the famous Cool Grove charnel ground near Bodh Gaya. As Shang writes in a eulogy to Galo, crow-faced Mahakala, hosts of flesh-eating mamos, even the Dharma protectors and guardians came to make offerings to you. And for 7 days, the frightening hell-like darkness gathered, and the storm raged around you. It was there in the cool grove that Galo was able to subjugate the crow-faced Dharma protector and force teachings from him. There's said to have been at one time a self-arisen image of the crow-faced protector in a cave Galo frequented near the holy lake Namso. The fullest account of this particular ritual can be found in a set of instructions addressed by Shang, again to his chief disciple, Dharma Shunu. The ritual begins with the preparation of a colored powder mandala, along with offering materials such as tormas and an effigy, thank you, Brian, linga, of the enemies to be liberated, probably paper in this case. At the center of the mandala within a divine palace sits the principal couple, the 4-armed wisdom Mahakala, Yishigompo, and his consort Nandi Keshvari in Yabum embrace. Their seat also incorporates this Chunjung figure, that double triangle we saw in the Karma Heruka ritual, and rests on an 8-petaled lotus flower. The couple is surrounded by a retinue that includes the crow-faced protector and a Remati Pendon Lamo. Pendon Lamo is the fierce female protector of the Lhasa Tsuklakang, which we'll see is very significant. She also figures in several key episodes in Shang's life as a ruler. She's described here as mounted on a red donkey with a white forehead, holding in her right hand a sword, and in the left a mongoose hide pouch with a blue-black colored body and 3 eyes in the midst of swirling black storm and flames. Guarding the Mahakala are 8 wrathful deities with animal heads, bird of prey, Garuda, blackbird, owl, pig, dog, wolf, and tiger, respectively. Also, the 4 great kings of the 4 directions and the protectors of the 10 directions. Finally, there are the 8 classes of gods and demons who shall play an important role later in the ritual. The central meditation places the visualized enemies into the triangle figure at the center of the mandala. From the state of emptiness, visualize the mandala of Mahakala with enemies and obstructors forced to enter the triangle in the middle of the circle of the 8 charnel grounds. Visualize wisdom Mahakala dwelling in the sky above them. Visualize the crow-faced Karma Mahakala in the midst of blazing red-black fire, letting loose a terrifying cry. And Pendan Lamo, the Mamos, the Dakinis, and all of the flesh-eating hosts abiding in enlightened activities. The enemies and obstructors are slain by the knife-wielding crow-faced protector, and wriggling helplessly, are eaten by the 8 classes of gods and demons of his retinue. The effigy portion of the ritual takes place over 7 or 21 days, during which time the life force, or soul, of the enemy is ritually coaxed into the linga, which is then cut up with a curved knife and placed inside the tormas. Later, the linga is burned in a ceremonial fire offering ritual, and the tormas are scattered in a charnel ground or on a mountaintop to be eaten by birds and wild beasts. These are just some of the highlights of a fairly long and elaborate ritual. So we see then that Shang, though he on at least 2 occasions swore off the use of Dharma protector-based subjugation rites, had at hand a full array of tantric practices designed to liberate living beings. Moreover, he and his disciples and commentators frequently invoked the language of liberation rituals to frame political and military events, styling opponents as enemies of the teaching, and Shang's activities as fierce deeds of wrathful compassion. I want to close by returning a little bit to that earlier idea. We'll skip that it's useful in some ways to view Shang as a kind of a proto-Dalai Lama. Certainly the 3rd and the 5th Dalai Lamas viewed him that way, incorporating him into their reincarnation lineages as a crucial link between the imperial Dharma kings on the one hand and the Dalai Lamas on the other hand. I suggest this as a check on the temptation to overemphasize his idiosyncratic personality, his unpredictability, his irascibility, his grandiosity, his proneness to violence. These are, of course, important parts of the story, but they should not be allowed to obscure the larger narrative, that in which the Tibetan kings star as divine protectors of the Dharma against the manifold enemies, protectors who, during this Chidar period, pass the royal baton on to the lamas. And I just want to suggest one more thing. Sometimes this duty to protect the Dharma is sort of condensed into the idea of protecting the Jokang statue itself. The Jokang is seen as a living representative of the Dharma, and the destruction of the Jokang would therefore result in the destruction of the Dharma in Tibet. In this respect, the Jo plays a role surprisingly similar to that played by the effigy or linga in the wrathful Mahakala rite. The effigy is a stand-in for the enemy, and the destruction of the effigy through magical homology destroys the enemy. Similarly, in the Lord of the Teachings narrative, the Jo is a stand-in for the Dharma, which if destroyed would, through magic homology, effect destruction of the Dharma. Now think again of the burning Tsuklakang of 1160. Might it not be seen as a sort of inverted liberation rite in which the object of annihilation is the Dharma itself? From this perspective, protection of the Jo is protection of the Dharma, the principal activity of a Bodhisattva Dharma king. I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. We're running a little late, so I'm going to press right on to Karma Phuntsok of the Loden Foundation, who's come all the way from Bhutan to speak with us on Mahakala and magic in the making of Bhutan.
Kuzo Zangpo, I hope you are still awake after lunch. It can be a bit difficult. I must, first thank Rubin Museum and Columbia University for organizing this conference and bringing some of us all the way from Asia. I also want to apologize that I don't have a discursive, intellectual, analytical paper to present, but I prepared a presentation for a general public audience. So I'll be taking you through the entire history of Bhutan in 20 minutes. So nation building and national history in many societies are much more than human endeavors. I was thinking of this piece, of how even the profane economic activity in this country invokes a divine power. So for a deeply spiritual country like Bhutan, the belief in influence of higher divine power in human evolution and nation building is so significant that sometimes it even overshadows human endeavors. Many traditional Bhutanese historians would even believe that Bhutan is a special dulshing or field of activity for saints like Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, and deities like Mahakala. Even in the pre-Buddhist worldview, the Bhutanese believed that its history and culture are deeply entwined with the belief in powerful magical forces of nature, such as mountain deities, cliff gods, river spirits, and so forth. And life with the Bhutanese was pretty much a relationship with the forces of nature. However, the actual accounts of introduction of Buddhism is where we find a systematic and detailed narrative of the use of magic and divine power to pacify the land, to civilize the people, to introduce law and order, and to establish society and state as a whole. So the earliest case that the Bhutanese think of today is of the temple building project of Songtsen Gampo. And among the temples, the Bhutanese claim that two fall in the current territory of Bhutan, and that this was the first instance of higher divine power being used to subjugate or suppress a supine demoness. According to Bhutanese historical accounts, the next big event happens in the 8th century with the arrival of Padmasambhava, who is believed to have meditated in a cave behind the temple and subjugated Shelgin Karpo, the evil spirit that stole the life force of King Sindaraja of this valley. Many years later, you have the story of Padmasambhava coming to Taksang, the tiger's nest, to subjugate Sengye Samdrup, the malevolent spirit of this cliff, and through that, also all the evil forces of the Himalayan world. Through wrathful activities, Padmasambhava taking up the exuberant wrathful form Dorje Drole. Such types of taming of the wild spirits using techniques of fear and violence, which is sanctioned in Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, recurs in the biographies and accounts of Buddhist masters who visited Bhutan in the subsequent centuries. The life of the Buddhist missionaries are filled with accounts of their Buddhist purpose, faith, magic, and religious power. With the rise of many Sarma schools in Tibet and their competition for social influence and economic patronage, we see greater use of such methods of magic and spiritual power to propagate religious faith and socio-political influence in places like Bhutan. We see this particularly in the life of this figure, an Eastern Tibetan priest who is said to have introduced Drukpa Kagyu tradition for the first time in the main Bhutanese valleys. Soon after his arrival in Bhutan, around 1222, Drugom Shikpo set up his base north of Thimphu, which was at that time under the domain of the Lhapa Lamas belonging to the Drigung tradition. So he was told to report to the Drigung headquarters and look after a Drigung center for 3 years, or herd their horses, look after the Drigung establishment, that little temple, or herd the Drigungpa horses for 3 years before he could settle in Bhutan. Drugom Shikpo, of course, defies their order, and that leads to an exchange of black magic and subtle diplomacy. So from his biography, for instance, we get this passage talking about how Paju visualized the dripshing of a palace and army and said, I am a universal monarch, what do you say? Challenging his opponents. And the 5 local rulers could not bear his aura and prostrated, ask him, which king's descendant are you? So you see this use of black magic or magical power and meditative power to win over political control in the area. Here's another passage. He built a hermitage and engaged in vigorous, fierce practice. The cavalry, that's the Jigungpa cavalry, were bound to arrive the next day or the day after. Jatelzong, which is a Jigungpa center, was suddenly struck with lightning, and some 10 people were killed. The temple in Chelka, that's the headquarters of the Jigungpa sect then, caught fire. The army arrived swiftly, but they could not find Tango, where Paju was based, or the conference where he built his shrine for occult power. The old beggar has left, they said, and I'm here, said Paju, and showed himself. They saw him as Hayagriva and ran scared of the mass of flames. So using occult power and also religious influence and astute diplomacy, Paju Drigom Shikpo managed by the middle of the 13th century to build a strong base for Drukpa Kagyu in western valleys of Bhutan, which would subsequently lead to the formation of the Drukpa state. But the actual act of forming the Drukpa state only takes place in the 17th century in the person of Shabdrung Namgyal. Shabdrung, born in 1594, was son of Jav family, a descendant of Sangpa Jari, the founder of Drukpa Kagyu school. He was also the 17th abbot of the Ralung monastery, the main center of the Drukpa Kagyu school. But early in his childhood, the Ralung family ran into trouble with the Tsangpa rulers. This is a modern rendering of Ralung, which doesn't exist anymore. They ran into trouble with the Tsangpa rulers on the issue of incarnation of the famous Drukpa scholar Pema Karpo. While the Ralung family claimed Shabdrung was the authentic reincarnation, the Tsangpa rulers supported a rival claimant from the Chongge family. And as the acrimony over the incarnation of Pema Karpo continued, Shabdrung's attendants had a conflict with the attendants of Pao Tsuklak Tengwa on the Takdruk river crossing, ferry crossing over the Sangpo. In a rush, the attendants of the Pao Tsuklak Tengwa Tulku dragged Shabdrung out of the boat, who was already in, and Shabdrung's attendants challenged, and in a subsequent fight, 2 of the attendants of Pao Tsuklak Tengwa were killed. The Tsangpa ruler took that opportunity to penalize Shabdrung further. He demanded that Shabdrung pay a serious fine or a tong to the Pao Tsuklak Tukus, which Shabdrung further defied. And the Tsangpa ruler then demanded that Shabdrung submit all the relics of the Drukpa Kagyu and come to the Tsangpo court. The Shabdrung, defying Tsangpa's orders, started to invoke Mahakala to challenge the king. And as a result of his supplication to Mahakala, we see this passage describing the signs of Mahakala's wrath. Great magical forces and signs of the wrath of the excellent Ishigyompo occurred. Most people in the Sang region were fear-stricken at night after darkness fell. People witnessed a ball of fire emitting sparks fly across the sky over Khatse, from Ralung towards Shikatse, and sometimes a ball of fire the size of a pot rolling along the road. Everyone undeniably saw great light like the sun appear at night. Many hundreds of crows gather and cow. Many previously unseen dogs roam about in the palace and in the place, and such other omens of Dharmapalas being angered. So this comes from Shabdrung's biography by Tsang Khenchen Pelden Jamso. The Tsangpa ruler decides to then send an army to attack Ralung. But fortunately for Shabdrung, there was somebody in the Tsangpa court who supported Ralung and sent intelligence about the imminent attack. And as a result, Shabdrung had to plan escaping. His initial thoughts were to go towards Mongolia and find a Mongolian warlord to support him. But he had a dream one night of a raven leading him southward to an unknown place. And a Bhutanese appeared in his center, asking him to come towards the south, saying that there's plenty of faith and land in the south, that every valley in the south is ruled by a useless chieftain, and every monastery led by a useless lama, and that he should come to introduce law in the lawless land, to give a handle to the handleless spot, if we were to use the idiom of the time. Shabdrung thus ventured to the south, and the Bhutanese patrons in western Bhutan received him. This is a recent enactment of the Shabdrung's arrival in Bhutan. You can see the king of Bhutan paying respects in this drama. He arrived at this center, this monastery that was founded by one of his ancestors, Drukgyal in Pangre Zampa, and he recognized this place to be the one that he saw in his dream, where the raven led him to. When he was in Bhutan, he received a letter from the Tsangpo ruler saying that he must return with the relics and submit again. To this, we have Shabdrung responding, saying, "You have done everything you can do to harm me. On my part, if I fail to eliminate the Tsangpo family line without a name, you may then decide that the Drukpa school in general does not have protecting deities, and I'm not the true Drukpa." Now, such defense, of course, leads to the first invasion of Bhutan by Tibet. So in 1618, the Tsangpo ruler sent a battalion, and while Shabdrung was in this temple doing some ceremony, they were suddenly attacked. He escaped. He went uphill along the slope, and here on this pass, he is supposed to have had a vision of Mahakala offering the land of Bhutan as his subject. The pass today is known as Jela, or the pass of vision or seeing. After passing this cross, he goes down into the valley, and at this holy site of Tselune, he, out of frustration, blows his trumpet 3 times towards Ralung, and calls upon the ancestors and the deities to tell him what he should do, if he should renounce life and become a hermit like Milarepa, or strive to carry on the Drukpa Kagyu school. And Dakinis appear in his dream, according to the biographer, telling him that he should strive further to promote the Drukpa Kagyu tradition. Thus, he resolves to go to Tango, this site, where Phadyu Drugom Shikpo, the person who brought Drukpa Kagyu to Bhutan, lived. He went to this center and meditated there to develop occult power. So he spent a long time cultivating magical power, and when he came out of the retreat, he took up this identity of Tuchen Ngawang Namgyal. As a result of his cultivation of occult powers, his opponent, the Tsangpo ruler, and some of the family members are said to have suddenly contracted smallpox and died. Hatsewa Ngawang Zangpo died from stroke, and the main leader of Chongge family also stabbed himself to death. So it became known in Tibet that the Drukpas are very powerful in their magical moments. So this proverb is supposed to have become popular. Don't compete with the Jigungpas in wealth, and don't compete with the Sakyapas in manpower, and with the Drukpas in magical power. He also then adopted this emblematic seal of the 16 eyes, which has, in the subsequent centuries, become the emblem of the Drukpa Kagyu state. Now, following the death of Tsangpo ruler Phuntsho Namgyal, Shabdrung then built his base in Bhutan. He first built this place, his first monastery. He went there also into a 3-year retreat to have spiritual training. And it was at the end of that retreat, again, when he was wondering if he should go back into retreat, he had some more visions telling him that he should build the state to support the Drukpa Kajwi church. And so he sets on to build this Dzong, the first fortified monastery Shabdrung built. But of course, building a state in a foreign land was difficult. There were a lot of local resistance. Local lamas obstructed him from building the temple, the Dzong, and they also got the Sangpa government to invade once more. As soon as the Dzong was done, there was a Tibetan invasion. They took over the Dzong, but then the explosives in the basement somehow caught fire, and the Dzong collapsed on the invaders. Shabdrung, of course, returned saying, "This is what my Mahakala does." Then he went on to found the new capital, the center Punakha, which again has a lot of magical, mythical elements of how it was built, timber and stone being provided with local deities, and the architect being taken to Padmasambhava's pure realm and so forth. And a couple of years after that, he started also building this other Dzong, Wangdi Podrang, and these two became the early centers of Shabdrung's government. And it was then that the Tsangpa ruler sent the third invasion, which he also managed to overcome. And as a celebration, he built the Gönkhang, Yule Namgyal, to honor Mahakala. Now, I have a lot to go through, so I'm going to sort of go through very quickly. In 1642, when the new government in Tibet came, Shabdrung had high hopes of striking a new friendship, but then the envoy he sent to Tibet was not well received by the secretary of the 5th Dalai Lama, and Shabdrung asked the envoy to then return. And when the envoy returned, Sonam Shöpal, the secretary of the Dalai Lama, felt insulted, so he sent a very harsh letter saying if Shabdrung must return to Tibet with all the relics, and if he doesn't, there will be a lot of Mongol soldiers who will be invading Bhutan and sent a bag of mustard seed to represent the Mongol warriors. Shabdrung is said to have pounded the seeds into a mash and returned it to Sonam Shöpal, saying, "My Mahakala will pulverize the Mongol soldiers." So, of course, the Mongol Gaden Podrang invasion takes place soon after that, which Shabdrung and his Bhutanese supporters managed to repel. In fact, there were 3 Gaden Podrang Mongol invasions in the time of Shabdrung's life, and they were successfully repelled. And this Dzong, for instance, was one that was built to celebrate the victory of the Bhutanese. What we see in this is there is a lot of rhetoric of using Mahakala's power and magic to defeat the enemies, both on the side of Shabdrung, but also on the side of Tibet. We have the 5th Dalai Lama writing about invasions to Bhutan and composing prayers to the Dharma protectors, which mentions Shabdrung as this destroyer of peace in the disguise of a monk or a meditating priest and so forth, and asking the protector deities to consume the flesh and the blood and the life of the enemies and so forth. But most of the Tibetan invasions to Bhutan more or less fail and don't succeed in defeating Shabdrung. This Dzong was also built after Lobsang Jimpa sent an invasion to Bhutan. So what you see is a series of Tibetan invasions which all failed. It was only in the now what happened with the early monastic rulers continued with the lay rulers as well. That when Bhutan had the 8th Desi, the first lay ruler, he also defied the Tibetan reprimands, and that led to war, again using the same rhetoric of Mahakala as you see in this text. So only when Pholane became the ruler of Tibet, and because Bhutan was internally divided, there was some semblance of a victory for the Tibetans in 1730s. But Bhutanese not only used magic and occult power towards the north, where they had enemies who are believers, but even towards the south, among the British, When the Bhutanese were confronted with the British forces in 1865, you have accounts of how Jigme Namgyal, the father of the first king, who had this raven crown designed for him by Gelugpa Rime Lama, he wore this helmet to war, and the stories of how a raven followed the troops, and he's supposed to have shot a British general in the head. And we continue now having the crowns that are based on that prototype that the kings wear. So what we have as a conclusion is that Bhutan is perhaps the only state today where there is a state monastic community that is fully dedicated to propitiating the protector deities, where rituals of magic and spiritual power are still carried out as a vital strategy for national security and defense, where you have the first national history with a full chapter dedicated to the accounts of the protector deities, the head of the state wearing a crown that has the sign of the raven-headed Mahakala, and also the two big festivals in the country, Punakha Dromche and Thimpu Dromche, being worships of Mahakala and Peldanhamo, but also celebrations of the warfare that took place during the foundation of Bhutan. So what we have today is, as it was in the beginning, Bhutan still remains a country where the dual systems of the spiritual and the secular, religion and politics, they merge both on the level of the state and in the ordinary lives of the people. And magic and rituals, faith, play a very important role in the Bhutanese notion of nation building and human development. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So since we're running a little behind, I will cut my comments short to allow some time for questions. So as Brian Cuevos introduced today, and details in his chapter on the politics of magical warfare in the Faith and Empire catalog, tantric ritual was seen as a means to manipulate the world with four main goals: pacification, enrichment, subjugation, and destruction. As Brian also underlines, magic was an integral part of warfare and political legitimacy in the Tibetan Buddhist world. While the exhibition traces the deployment of this extraordinary ritual power in the service of empires, such as Mahakala's role in the Tangut and Mongol courts, as we learned from Brian, not all Tibetans welcomed Mongolian or imperial involvement in Tibetan affairs, and repeated incursions into Tibetan lands resulted in a cottage industry of ritual war magic specialists known as the Mongol repellers. Both sides used magical warfare in the protracted war in central Tibet that brought the Dalai Lamas to power in the 17th century. And as George Fitzherbert's work elucidates, the Great Fifth recognized that, despite resistance within his own Gelugpa order, the political charisma accrued to those who mastered such magical power was crucial to his regime's survival. Now, Lama Shang is a fascinating study in the political and martial employment of Tantric Buddhism in the 12th century, well explored by Karl Yamamoto. He, now Lama Shang, not Karl, engaged in political and military affairs, ruled territory, and enforced secular law. He even fielded his own students into battle as part of their religious practice. In addition to conventional weapons, Lama Shang employed a ritualized warfare of magic spells purportedly aided by powerful protected deities such as Red Yamari and Mahakala. Indeed, Lama Shang is the inspiration for this panel's title. In Karl's presentation, the use of magical warfare, or as he more dramatically puts it, politically motivated ritual murder, that should be the title of a book. Context is important in understanding how this is perceived by both Lama Shang himself and the outside world. Central Tibet is in chaos. Armed conflict among opposing religious factions has led to the unbelievable, the burning of the city's two most sacred sites, which are foundational to Buddhism in Tibet, the Jokang and Ramoche. Lama Shang was tasked with restoring order as the Lord of the Teachings, and in asserting political authority, apparently by any means necessary, he sees himself as reinstating the king's law of the old Tibetan Empire, performing kingly deeds. Before this, his performance of black magic for revenge and so on, Lama Shang seems to view as unvirtuous, but in the service of his Lama's commission, they are righteous, and the view of his enemies as demonic forces ripe for liberation is a kind of classic dehumanizing language in a time of conflict. Now, while the exhibition and publication could have included a much wider range of Tibetan Buddhist political engagement, I chose to focus the narrative of the continuum through the imperial courts of Inner Asia and China. That meant that many important polities were regrettably left out, such as Bhutan. As Karma Phuntsok has so nicely underlined, Bhutan is especially important to this discussion as political engagement with ritual magic, including state propitiation of wrathful deities, is very much a living tradition, still practiced by the Bhutanese today. Karma Phuntsok also nicely elucidates that this is very much a part of a larger national narrative, from the magical subjugation of the land by the archetypal wizard Padmasambhava in the 8th century, all the way to repelling the British in the 19th century. The vision of the raven leading Shabdrung south must be an allusion to raven-headed Mahakala, who then offers the land to Bhutan as his realm and helps him subjugate it. Ritual magic is taken very seriously, met with both military and counter-ritual responses. As many of our sources are hagiographic, the ritual contributions of these masters at times comes to overshadow the military role in conflict and victory. This underlines the fact that, while this may be met with incredulity by modern historians, or even turned a blind eye by modern Western practitioners, tantric ritual technologies to physical power and the potency of harnessing protector deities were central to Himalayan and Inner Asian concepts of political power. I'd like to invite the speakers up so we have some time for questions.
So thank you so much for your wonderful talks, and they're truly amazing. So my question is, so in addition to the tantric rituals and cosmic competitions, we often see occurrence of physical violence throughout the history, like how Lama Shang and the Fifth Dalai Lama seized their powers, and also armed conflicts between Bhutan and Tibet, and the repetitive rationale or rhetoric to legitimate the use of armed conflict was the defense of Dharma. So my question is, in your respective research and context, do you see many of those deeds or actions offensive or defensive? And in general, how would you characterize Tibetan or Bhutan military culture? Thanks.
Okay, I guess I'll take that. Yes, the justification of defending the Dharma is the consistent message that you would see in this type of rituals. The issue of defense versus offense. If you're capable of healing, you're very capable of harming. So it just depends on a perspective. What perspective? From one side, you're defending. From the other side, you're offending, right? And in both cases, the two camps may actually be seeing that they are protecting the Dharma. The other person is not following the Dharma properly, or they're not Dharma at all, right? And they need to use our own language now, an intervention, right? They need to be forcefully liberated for the Dharma, you know, in that case. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but
I was a little confused when I first ran upon these descriptions of enemies of the teachings proliferating throughout Tibet, because knowing about Tibetan history, I'm thinking, well, it was all Buddhists, right? They're all Buddhists. It took me a while to understand that this particular rhetoric, which was tied to the liberation ritual and that styled the object of liberation as an enemy of the teaching, and it had nothing to do with non-Buddhists overrunning Tibet or anything like that. I sometimes think it's a little bit unfair. This is something that comes up with my students. A little unfair that Buddhism is sort of singled out as a peaceful religion, because people tend to forget that Buddhism exists in the real world. And in the real world, there are wars, whether just or unjust, they're there. It's a part of real political life, and there's no such thing as a country that has no wars. So a kind of extra pressure is put on Buddhists because it's like you're supposed to be peaceful, right? Well, it doesn't quite work that way. It's about this tension between ideals and realities that I think comes out really nice in a symposium like this.
If I may add a bit to this, I think it's common to find this trope of enemies of the teachings, but then one way you can appreciate this is, I think, to go back to what Tsering Shagala mentioned earlier this morning, that what represents the true teachings to that particular person. And most of the time, it's the Gelugpa teachings for the Gaden Podrang, or the Dukkaju teachings for Shabdrung and his disciples. So you are defending your sect, not all of Buddhism, because your sect and tradition represents the full, authentic transmission and lineage. So I think that plays a major role in justifying your action. And whether they're more offensive or defensive, I think it depends on the situation. In case of the conflicts between Bhutan and Tibet, there are cases when the Tibetan government was more offensive, but also times when they were more defensive. And the same applies also for Bhutan. And I think it goes really case by case.
Other questions?
Thank you. This is a really, oh, sorry, someone else. Okay. Then I'll keep speaking. This is a really great panel. I really enjoyed it. Thank you all. I had a question for Karma Phuntsho about to what degree is Mahakala associated with the land? And in contemporary Bhutan, I know there's movements which resemble kind of modern liberal environmentalist defense kind of movements, and I wonder if there's something there that is also associated with Mahakala.
Unfortunately, none, I would say. None that is significant, although this discourse of Mahakala being associated with Bhutan, or Bhutan being a field of activity for Mahakala, is something that the nationalistic historians have created. But if you were to look for concepts that would relate more to a sort of ecological, environmental conservation, I think the better religious concepts associated with the land would be the hidden valleys or the sacred landscapes associated with Padmasambhava. And there are many of them, not only in Bhutan, but all across the Himalayas. And especially in Bhutan, they have been used fairly effectively for ecological conservation.
This is just a general question for anybody on the panel. Can you tell us a little bit about to what extent Bonpo has any relationship with the magical rituals that you've been describing, if there is a relationship?
Okay. Yeah. No, I don't mention that. But anyway, well, you would find actually very similar practices in the Bonpo tradition as you find in the Buddhist traditions. The issue of whether, I know that you may, there is information out there that the Bonpo may have been the source of this sort of ritual for the Buddhists. But actually, much of this material, much of what I was discussing, has deep Indian roots, and that aren't specifically Bonpo, or indigenously Tibetan. So what we'd see is that both the Bonpos and the Tibetans are taking part in a similar technology available to them. and utilizing their versions of that technology, whether it be Bunpo or Buddhist. Does that help? Okay. Yes.
Bunpo, that's kind of a difficult term. Sometimes it's just used synonymous with indigenous Tibetan religions. So I'll skip the Bunpo part and just talk about indigenous Tibetan religions. But as Brian says, a lot of these practices came over from India. And I know, for instance, that the crow-faced Mahakala shows up in some of the versions of the Tenjir, the canonical texts that are translated from India. But I think there are also definitely indigenous contributions to this ritual traditions. In the course of my work, I was reading this, what's his name? He's an archaeologist, I guess. John Beletsa came upon this text of just like the 9th to 10th century, and it's in this, you can't call it a pre-Buddhist text because Buddhism was there, but it's sort of halfway in between. And there are some very interesting rituals, one of which includes the destruction of an enemy using a crow through appeal to a crow, some kind of a crow deity, and the symbolic liberation is effected with a crow's wing. I found that just really fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of bird lore in indigenous Tibetan culture, and crows, ravens, these that have been seen as powerful birds for a long time. I'd love to see where that all comes together, because clearly there's an Indian tradition, but it also has kind of resonance with Tibetan traditions, and it comes out with all of this wonderful stuff we're looking at now.
Yeah, on that, it's interesting, the dripshing that I mentioned as the cloak of the cloaking stick, and karma, you left it untranslated, but it was up there. That typically is formed with the crows, with the wood from crows' nests. Yeah. So anyway, there's that crow thing for you. Yeah.
We have time for a final question.
In the description of the rituals that two of you presented, all the rituals were to diminish or harm your opponent. But theoretically, your opponent's using ritual against you. So are there any rituals to prevent them from using ritual to diminish you or harm you? Because none of you described any of those.
Yes, actually, they're sort of counter rituals that are going on. Much of what I described briefly could be used as a means of undercutting the rituals that are being performed against you. These are actually the defensive rituals are meant to undercut the power of the ritual of the other side. So yes, they're definitely countermeasures for these rituals. In terms of the content of the rites, they're very similar. I mean, it's not too different. But yes, there are counter rituals.
Yes, if I might add, I think among the rituals there is a class that would be more defensive in nature than proactive. So quite a lot of rituals are about protecting oneself rather than harming the others. But even in terms of proactive ones, which I didn't manage to mention earlier, is sometimes you actually physically plant things. So Shabdrung had this magical talisman planted in the Tsangpa court in Shigatse. And later on, when they reconciled, he was instructing people where these things were hidden and how they should remove them. So there's a lot of active engagement, but also a great deal of defensive rituals, and especially among the ordinary sort of concepts of tu, which is quite prevalent in many parts of Tibet, and in Bhutan it's still a living sort of culture. If your power is exceeded by your opponents, they even fear that your magical power will sort of bounce back on you and make the impact much greater for the opponent. So there are rituals to sort of defend yourself from that.
I was just thinking about when Lama Shang held rule in the central Tibetan area, he did something called sealing territory. and sealing. There were different kinds of seals, but basically it was kind of like a ritual creation of a protected, a safe space, if you want, right? A safe space as it was used back then. And it's very much like tantric rituals that have to do with creating like a protective perimeter around a meditator or around a mandala. When they're making a mandala, they always go around and do mudras and mantras on the periphery. Sometimes you see a kind of military metaphor used for the tantric rituals, defense, building a defensive wall. So you do see that, things like that.